Hello, welcome back to Classical Christian Thought. I'm your host, Eric Ibarra, and today we have a great treat for you guys. I have a longtime friend of mine, Pat Flynn, who I'm sure you all know because every time I speak about him on my Patreon or in my chat groups, people all know who he is, so I know I don't need to introduce him. Pat, how are you?
That is very kind, Eric. I'm great because I'm chatting with you, and it's been way too long, my friend. And I just realized, longtime friend. That's true, man. We've been
Yeah.
friends for a while now. It's crazy to think about because if people don't know, we both used to live in Wisconsin together, and we kind of have a funny story of the first time we hung out. But yeah, I can't believe how long ago that actually
Yeah,
was.
no, yeah, like COVID, we were all just anxious for COVID to get over with, and then we were in Wisconsin for another year after that, and the years just flew, and so much wasn't done, and so much was done. It almost feels like just going from one room to the next, and we've got a number of years that have passed by. So,
Yeah. Well, it's
but
it's it's great to be here. It's great to see you again.
yeah, thank you. This is your first time on my channel, I think.
Yeah, excited, man. This looks great. I love the intro. Your
Yeah.
set looks way more professional than mine. So I gotta up my own game.
No, yeah, but you make up for it in many, many ways. There's no reason to doubt anything that Pat says.
Oh man. How about that? I will see.
Yeah, your content is pure gold, and I love listening to it because you've got a mixture. Whenever you don't know something, which is not always the case, obviously, uh, you admit it, and you have a certain posture about it that shows that you've done the research, and if something isn't as certain, you'll talk about that, and
Yeah.
then you'll also back up things with sources and persons you've studied, scholars and names. It's just, I don't know, it's like I don't, you fade into the background when you teach, Pat.
Oh well.
It's
Yeah.
one of the great things. It's a gift of that not every teacher has.
Well, if we could just turn this into the Mutual Admiration Society, just briefly, I clearly think the same thing about you. And in fact, when I was first kind of getting familiar with the Catholic intellectual landscape, I was asking our friend Gary Machuda, like, who's really good on like the East and West stuff? And he brought you up immediately and he just sung your praises. And yeah, immediately when I engaged your material, I saw, okay, this is the kind of guy that I'm into, right? Rigorous, charitable, humble, seems to have all those sorts of intellectual virtues of somebody who takes issues seriously, is willing to engage with hard issues. And if I, don't sound wrong a lot, it's only because I just focus on such a narrow set of things that I can hyper concentrate on it. I just don't talk about a whole bunch of other stuff because, as you know, Eric, right? When you get into the weeds of real issues, man, it's tough.
Yeah.
It's really, really, really tough. You got a
Oh
whole
yeah.
bunch of really smart people who disagree about something that's like this wide.
Yeah.
Man, if you go super deep, you're just not going to go that wide and do a good job, which is funny because I kind of talk about being a generalist, but that has its limits. When it comes to philosophy, I am much more of a specialist, right? I kind of stick within my
Yeah.
narrow band of,
Yeah.
natural theology and even, just like bands within that band,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, that's just the truth, right? And that's sort of you can kind of tell who's been in the weeds from who hasn't, from people who, yeah, they're rigorous, but they're willing to acknowledge, hey man, there's some really smart people who don't really go with me on this. Here's
Yeah.
why I think they're wrong, but I don't know, I could be wrong too. So
Yeah.
give me what I got, and that's it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it takes broad shoulders to do that because sometimes you'll look like you lack credibility. But in the long run, it pays off because I've had a lot of people come to me years later and say, I really just put you off when I heard you say this a long time ago. But after reading all these books now, I can see why you took the approach that you took.
The long hard road, yeah.
Yeah, and now there are some things that I am certain about, and I'm bulldogmatic about, but there are a lot of things that they just I'm not the chair. I don't sit on a chair that could be speaking that way about it. So, but Machuda, you mentioned Machuda. Machuda is such a tender-hearted man. I mean, such a kind man. I was blessed to meet him too. When I visited Michigan, I never knew how tall the man was.
He's a giant. A gentle giant, but he
Yeah.
is. Yeah. We hung out with his family. He was extremely gracious. Had us all over. Cooked food for us, and he had a little bunny rabbit. Funny to see a giant man with a little bunny rabbit, but it was it was nice. It
Isn't that
worked.
something?
Yeah. But great guy, and can't recommend his stuff. And so generous, really, just so generous. Real quick, because you brought up such a good point, I don't want to let it slip by. Is that you're right? Like, man, there's so many issues in the kind of the sort of the sphere, the online sphere, right? On the one hand, you have these sort of shallow apologetics, and yeah, they might be more appealing superficially, but in the long run, they do a lot of harm, because if people keep chasing issues, man, that stuff explodes real quick, and people will lose their confidence. They'll realize that that person was not credible, and they'll have their positions really shaken because they were never sturdy to begin with. Right. So I don't think that's a good model. I think it shows a certain immaturity and a lack of serious depth and engagement, if that's what people are taking.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there is, and you see this more among, like, I guess, the professional philosophers, there's also just sort of the reverse of this sort of modesty signaling, right?
Yeah.
Where people are like, no, like, I know you're more confident than you're pretending to be, right?
Yes.
So what people should do is just be as confident as you are about the things that you feel you're really confident about, and things can come in degrees. Like, okay, here's 3 things that I feel like I'm as certain as I can be about anything.
Right.
And here's a whole bunch of stuff that I think I can make a decent case for. I'm not, totally, certain if that can even be achieved, but I think I got a good little case going. So let's test it out. Like, not everything has to be, absolutely rock solid, secure, give the metaphysical demonstration for it, right? Things can come in degrees of how, justified you think you are in holding this. And what I found, Eric, is true. When you're upfront with people about that, it builds a much better long-term relationship and credibility and trust, for sure. Mm-hmm.
It does. And then also the patience pays off, because even when we are really right about something, we don't always demonstrate it well. And when you show that patience of willing to be corrected, it buys you the time to start introducing the way to demonstrate it. And then over time, you make it better and better and better and shorter and easier and more convincing. And then once you've merited the rock climb of carving your demonstration or your presentation, then you could start adding that note of, no, this is this I have a strong case here, and I'm not going to get rid of it until somebody deals with this. And so I think sometimes when we know something is right, but we haven't worked on our demonstration of it, we can fall into a mistake, because once we try to demonstrate it, we realize, oh, wait a minute, my mind's more certain than my presentation can prove.
Yeah. That is a real trap that you can fall into. And I think something we have in common here, Eric, is that, I know we have it in common because we've discussed it, is that we've both been on the other side, or other sides. We both had periods where we were atheist, right?
Yeah.
I was never in the Protestant world at all. Not enough that I could actually make that claim. But I look back at the time when I was an atheist, and I don't think I was a total moron, right? And a lot of the objections that I would have brought up are still objections that I think are very much worth attending to and treating seriously. And the understanding that I had of theism and God back then, I still think is quite reasonable to reject even now, right? It was really me just coming into a new conceptual understanding of what God actually is. For me, also just seeing a lot of explanatory issues within the naturalistic worldview. So it was a cumulative case for me that got me to change my mind. But I think there's benefits um, in being somebody who has actually spent time on the other side. One, because hopefully you can know it decently well and represent it fairly and have a certain, sympathy or empathy for those positions and be able to converse with them in a certain way. But even beyond that, I remember there was, kind of when I was sort of at the end of my naturalist period, Eric, I literally threw my hands up. I'm sure you've had that happen before.
Oh yeah.
Throw your hands up. I'm like, I do not know what is true, but I'm getting close to certain that this isn't it, right?
Right.
And then at that point, like I really, honestly, I know this is a cheap thing to say, but I just wanted to know what was true, right? So at that point, like objections are your friend. Objections are like the philosopher's love language, because what do objections do? They test the strength of arguments, right?
Yeah.
Will this argument survive the battery of objections? If it can't, I don't want it, right? It's not
Right.
helping me get to the truth of things. So I always encourage people, like, don't look at objections, because people are always going to give you objections. Don't look at objections like a negative thing or a personal thing. They're argument testers. They can give you a very valuable service, either in helping you uh, strengthen your argument if it needs to be strengthened, or even just clarify what you mean along the way in certain steps of the argument, or give a better presentation of it, like you're saying. So I don't know what my whole point is there with
No,
all that,
yeah,
but yeah.
it's a great point, because it really does explain why your book is so good. Because as you brought up in the book somewhere in the beginning that you kind of wanted the book to be sober, serious, critical, but also something that you could, like, sitting at a pub or a bar and have a conversation with somebody, to talk about this philosophical exercise. And you really do come across as somebody who knows what it's like to sit on both sides of the discussion. And that was one of the biggest shining features of the book. um, and that, and also just the level of charity that charity or fairness that you give to the other side. Because you mentioned objections and people having a hard time dealing with those. I think it's very much like physical exercise, which
Mm.
a lot about. If you guys don't know, Pat Flynn is this shredded muscle dude. He's a kettlebell expert. You can see all of his stuff on YouTube. But when you start getting into physical exercise, running a lap is like, oh man, it gets you. It makes you
Mhm.
anxious. It messes with your emotions. But once a person starts to go from, to quote Fight Club, like from a wad of cookie dough to being carved out of wood, you start to crave the exercise.
Mm.
And I think
Mhm.
it's the same way in philosophy and theology, or at first it's like there's so many things, there's so many people who know more than me, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to, like, really compete and join the team of dialogue and discourse. But once you start to get used to the method, all of a sudden looking at critical arguments and objections, it doesn't sting you anymore.
Right.
And it's like you crave the method, and whether you're right or wrong at the end of the tunnel, that's not even hitting you either. It's like whatever the outcome is, I just crave the exercise, right? And so I think that having that disposition, which you clearly do have, and then also at the same time coming out with such a successful case, um, which for the viewers, we're alluding to a book that Pat Flynn wrote, which a lot of you guys already know about, "The Best Argument for God," published by Sophia Press. And I actually gave an endorsement for it because it was well deserving of that. And I want to tell you, Pat, what you've done with this book is simply a remarkable achievement. I think of that one scene in A Beautiful Mind at the. I don't know if you've seen that with Russell Crowe's
I
big.
have, but probably not since it came out. So I'm a little foggy on it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, at the end, I forget if it was Princeton. I think it was Princeton. Where whenever a scholar at Princeton does something remarkable, that he sits in a certain academic hall, and all the other scholars and fellows come over and like place a pen on the table. It's just a notoriety thing. And I think this book, it really deserves that kind of praise, because this is a philosophically rigorous book, and it's not just for Catholics. It's not a religious book in that sense. An atheist could read it and really get into the spar, and know and be confident that the author he's reading has seriously done his work, So by doing such an amazing achievement like this, I think for my viewers, and I think it's well worth rehearsing, what is it specifically? Because we've touched upon, you were an atheist, naturalist. A lot of our listeners have probably listened to you on Matt Fradd's channel and other, on your own channel.
Mm-hmm.
What was it that specifically led to this project? And
Yeah.
what is, you obviously achieved something great, but what was the buildup for this specific thing? Because I know you're always working on some other project.
Yeah. Yeah. There's always
What
something in the
what
crock
was it
pot.
for this? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you, Eric. That's exceedingly kind. I don't even know how to handle compliments like that, to be honest. It just makes me gyrate. That's really, really nice. Thank you. And it means a lot. So, it's funny because I remember you were telling me about your papacy book, and, you wrote it like, so many years after you got the contract, but it was really something like 10 years in the making. Right.
Yeah.
And it was very much a similar story, with this book. It's like, yeah, I had got the contract and I had to get it done by a certain deadline, but man, the making of this book was a lot bigger than that for me, probably about 10 years in the making, and just writing different drafts of a lot of different stuff, having a lot of false starts, having a lot of stuff that was kind of close to there. And then I just threw it all away and, just refining things, learning more, researching more, realizing that I could do better. So the genesis of when it actually became the book for Sophia was, so it took about a year and a half to write once I actually signed the contract. And I did actually write about 200,000 words originally that got completely scrapped. I mean, completely, because the problem was it was just totally inaccessible, right? I just dumped everything. I wanted to deal with, the feeling,
Yeah,
right?
I
You just
know
want
how
to deal with everything. Okay. Give me the problem of evil. Give me modal collapse. Give me it all, right? Right? I want to deal. And my editor's like, dude, you got to pump the brakes here. So, and he was right. He was totally right. It's like, what kind of book do I want to write? And I want to write a book that will serve a large number of people, not just a professional philosopher. But I really wanted this to be a book that can be handed to the professional philosopher as well. So that was the most difficult part of the book, Eric, was getting the tone and the presentation right, of how do I make this distilled without being diluted, right, or distorted? How do I get the tone right so I can still give a rigorous case, but somebody isn't going to have to reach for a bottle of Advil in the first, first two paragraphs, right? And here's the honest truth. Thank God for my wife, Christine, it's as simple as that. I just fed her draft after draft after draft. And my other editor was very good too, but really Christine, she's a writer, she's an editor, and she just has this amazing talent to just kind of take the the knots that fall out of my head that like 3 people could maybe understand, and just get it straightened out. So, when I had these compliments about the book, which again are very meaningful, I just had that it was not a solo effort. It was a team effort on many fronts, and particularly the help from my wife of getting the book to the point where I felt it actually hit the right balance between accessibility and rigor, almost entirely Christine's doing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah, it is amazing. It's a gift. It is a gift because I remember when I was writing the papacy book, I did that too. I handed in 1,000 pages on a Word document that I think if they moved it to the edit for how they were going to put it onto their PDF, it probably would have been more longer than
We work in similar ways, it seems. Yeah.
but the individuals that went to edit it and helped me with the project, they shortened things, and I was very worried about that, right? But when I saw what they were doing, I thought to myself, wow, I am humbled. I am humbled. It was such a gift that these editors have, and they learned about the papacy, but then they were able to reformulate things. So yeah, I know what that's like to see somebody as gifted as your wife to take these things and put that into an engaging way of reading the book, because that's your book really is. It sucks you in right away, and that tone is pretty consistent throughout the whole
Mm-hmm.
book. So very, very good achievement. Congrats to her. Congrats to you. What a great project. So, one of the things that comes out in the book the most is it's a unique approach, right? But what do you think led you to approach it this way? Was it your own experience as a former philosophical naturalist, or was it that you had certain contenders in
Yeah.
mind
Yeah.
that you wanted to hit, in the right way?
Yeah. Great question. This will help us get into perhaps some of the actual methodology that I use in the book. And when it comes to philosophical approaches to God, there's really 2 broad approaches. There's more than just 2 approaches, but there's 2 that have been particularly influential. There's what we might call the sort of traditional approach. And the traditional approach is when you send some grisly philosopher into the field to do metaphysics, right? And they start sort of carving reality at its joints, saying, hey, here's a phenomena, change. What are the necessary conditions for change? Well, we need an act potency distinction or whatever, right? And they're trying to make sense of large scale features of reality. They're starting in philosophy of nature and moving to metaphysics, and they're just trying to search out the necessary conditions or causes of these features, whether it's change or identity through time or what have you, right? But then what happens is you sort of get, I think if you do this right and well, you get sucked into the tractor beam, the logical tractor beam of the ultimate necessary condition or cause for all of that, right? And this, of course, would be the absolutely simple first principle of all, God. That's your traditional approach. You start in philosophy of nature or metaphysics, and then the idea here is we're starting from some feature of the world that is just effectively undeniable because it's just so common, and it's hard to think about how one could coherently deny something like the fact that change occurs. There are people out there who do, but most people are willing to at least grant you that. And then through a sort of deductive approach, we're searching out the ultimate necessary condition, which ends up being a being of pure actuality, or absolutely ontologically simple or whatever, right? So we need the immutable to make sense of the changing. We need the necessary to make sense of the contingent. We need the simple to make sense of the composite, so on and so forth. What you find in this traditional approach are these great category shifts, right? That we have these certain categories in the natural world that are in some sense inadequate and to be a sort of self-sufficient type of being, right? So they're always kind of pointing beyond themselves for some further condition to explain why they actually occur rather than not. So we say there's sort of contingency implying, right? I mean, contingency, of course, is itself contingency implying, but
Right.
composite things seem to imply contingency. I actually think compositeness gives an explanation for contingency. Changing things seem to imply contingency, that things are receiving new modes of being or actuality, right? That what they are is really distinct from the fact that they are. And then, yes, you have to make a sort of profound category shift to give an ultimate adequate explanation of these contingent phenomena, right? That's a traditional approach to God. I've always been really interested in that. I actually think it's the strongest approach. It's the area I spend the most time on. Not only because I think it is the strongest way to get to God philosophically, I think it also gives you the richest and most accurate conception of God when you take a metaphysics approach first. The downside to that is people don't like to do a lot of metaphysics these days. Sometimes they confuse it with metamucil, right? So it's hard to make that approach accessible, right? But I think I think it's a very fruitful approach. The other approach, and this is a more contemporary approach, is this sort of idea of worldview comparison. And this is where philosophers are kind of, I don't want to say pretending, but acting more like scientists, right? They bring a hypothesis to the table, a worldview, if you will, right? There's lots out there. In the book, I'm mostly interested in comparing classical theism with, metaphysical naturalism, which is a philosophically developed form of atheism. But there's other worldviews that doesn't form like a perfect partition, right? There's animism and other forms of pantheism and stuff like that. But anyways, the way this method works is somebody kind of brings their hypothesis forth, and then philosophers will kind of say, okay, well, here's a bunch of stuff that a worldview needs to explain or make sense of. Again, usually broad, features of reality. Like, hey, there are contingent things, or there are things that are causally capable, or there's a moral dimension, or there's stability and order, right? What sort of worldview can help to explain these phenomena, right? And then what you do is you kind of test the worldviews based on certain criteria of theory selection. And when it comes to worldview comparison, the most important criteria there would be explanatory comprehensiveness, right? How well does it actually account for or anticipate the relevant data? And simplicity in some sense, theoretical simplicity, ontological simplicity, conceptual simplicity. Ironically, whenever philosophers talk about simplicity, it's an enormously complicated debate, whether it's in the theory selection or divine simplicity. There's nothing simple about simplicity when it comes to philosophy. And anyways, Eric, long story short is I've always thought that there is a fruitfulness to that approach as well. But what you find among philosophers who are interested in natural theology or arguments for or against the existence of God is they usually fall in one camp or the other. The sort of traditionally minded philosophers, they don't like that worldview comparison stuff. They think that it gives you too weak of a case for God, or that it invites a lot of anthropomorphism about God. And I think some of those criticisms are legitimate. However, the worldview comparison people say that, look, the sort of traditional metaphysical approach is itself laden with all sorts of upfront complications. You got to settle all sorts of, deep metaphysical issues that are highly controversial before you can even launch into the arguments for God's existence. So that's kind of a mess. So what I want to do is show, no, we can merge these approaches in a fruitful way. We can take a metaphysics, a minimally metaphysical approach first. So what I do is I try to give the minimum effective dose of metaphysics and philosophy of nature to get like the fewest things we need to get into that sort of metaphysical demonstration for God. And then I try to develop a standalone argument there that some people may or may not find convincing on its own. But then I say, well, look, if nothing else, this gave us a pretty philosophically rich conception of God. It gave us a pretty, decently filled out worldview that we can now, take along into this game of worldview comparison, right? Like we've got a worldview that's filled out. We have a pretty rich, I think, conception of God that is free of these anthropomorphisms because we did that sort of traditional metaphysical approach first. Now let's see how well it fares against some other hypothesis. I'm interested in naturalism, a particular form of naturalism, in explaining like everything else. Right. Order, stability, morality. What else do I have in the book? Oh, suffering and evil, right? That's another big one.
Or beings like us,
consciousness, rationality, all that
human
stuff.
beings are, Yep.
Yeah, and so then what I say is like, okay, maybe you that first metaphysical argument totally convinced you. Great, you can close the book. You can, then you can move on to the question of, is some religion true? Because my book is only about whether God exists, right? You're right. It's not a religious book. So then you could move on to that. You could go read Eric's book after my book or something like that, right? Or you might think, okay, well, that was provocative, Pat, what you did first, but I need a little bit something extra, a little more confirmation of this. And then that's where that other approach, I think, can come in to help gain that extra confirmation of seeing how theoretically fruitful this worldview actually is, how well it can explain the things that need to be explained, and indeed how at the end of the day it wins out, I think, on the simplicity criteria as well, once we have a decent enough understanding of what we're looking for in that department. Sorry, I was really rambly.
No, you're good. You're good. So you explain in the book that sometimes it's called abduction, trying to find explanation. Could you go into a little bit about that, like this exercise of getting the best explanation, and then maybe touch upon the principle of sufficient reason?
Yeah, good. So the principle of sufficient reason, I'll kind of divide these up, is looking more towards these traditional arguments. So the way that these traditional, and then I'll come back to abduction or inference to the best explanation. So the PSR, the way traditional arguments generally work is, yes, we are starting from some broad feature of reality, like the fact that there are contingent things. This is a good way to introduce PSR. But then we need a principle. We need some sort of like causal or explanatory principle that's actually sort of the engine of cosmological reasoning. And I want to say, and I do say, that I think most, not all, but most traditional arguments for the existence of God, including Aquinas's, are committed to the principle of sufficient reason. They're not explicit about it, but it's in the background. It's in their back pocket, right? In some form or other. Now, the PSR comes in different forms, and I wouldn't endorse all forms, but I would endorse a form that says something like this: hey, for anything that exists, there is some adequate reason, explanation for its existence and why it has the characteristics that it does, either from the principles of its own nature, either from its, essence, what it is, or some extrinsic productive cause. Something like that is what we would call the principle of sufficient reason, right? Now, to give a very condensed executive summary of how that relates to an argument for the existence of God, is if we're considering this, and this would be a sort of Leibnizian approach, and I actually like Thomas's approach is better, but I think this is just a useful illustration of this style of approach or philosophical approach to God. Is if we're thinking about contingent things, right? And a contingent thing is something that could have been otherwise or not at all, like me, or a baked potato, right? Most of the things we encounter or think about, they're contingent, right? They are, but they don't have to be. There's nothing about their nature that guarantees or demands their inclusion in reality, right? Well, what the PSR is going to do is, if the PSR is true, and when you first introduce it to like the person on the street, they're like, oh yeah, that's super obvious. Is this all that you philosophers do? But it's actually quite controversial among philosophers, right? So I spent a good amount of time in the book actually saying, hey, here's why we should think this principle is true. But don't just assume it. But assuming it's true for the sake of this conversation, what it's going to do is it's going to wrap around all contingent things, right? So if the PSR is true, then we'll just smush all the contingent facts together and say, okay, if PSR is true, we need an explanation of why there's anything of the type contingent at all. And to avoid circularity, what that's going to do is it's going to produce the result of at least one necessary being. Right. And now that doesn't immediately prove God, but it shows something very interesting is afoot, right? That there's something in reality that's pretty spooky, right? That's got to be very, very different than pretty much everything that we're familiar with. And then we could start thinking about, well, what could be a necessary being that's also causally capable, because it has to somehow produce the result of contingency, and it has to produce the result of contingency. Not just it has to produce a result of other beings, but these beings have to stay contingent. So the question is, how do you get contingency from necessity, right? Right. And the worry there is, well, why doesn't necessity produce more necessity, right? And I actually think God's a really good model here, because if God wills himself necessarily, but not creation necessarily, we have something analogous to free choice in God. So an act of volition, of creative volition, is actually a good model for how we can have a necessary being that produces a contingent result. And that's good. We want a model that can that can get both, right? Not just necessity at the bottom to secure contingency, but to keep the contingent, right? So that's how the PSR runs in one traditional form of cosmological reasoning. But I think it's in Aquinas's too. If I just give a sketch of Aquinas's, what Aquinas is doing, he's doing more kind of upfront metaphysics, and he's looking at just everyday objects. Take like a bunny rabbit, right? And what Aquinas is saying is, hey, this bunny rabbit is a complex. It's a metaphysical complex. It's a metaphysical complex of an essence element, a whatness element, and an existence element or an actuality element, right? And what Aquinas is going to argue is that this distinction is real, that the essence of Thumper the bunny rabbit, right, does not include or guarantee Thumper's existence in the actual world. He's got all sorts of arguments for the real distinction, but again, we'll just assume it for the sake of this conversation. I explore a number of them in my book. But then what he's going to do is he's going to start looking for a cause, right? If Thumper can't account for his existence in virtue of what Thumper is, then something outside of Thumper must do it, assuming that Thumper isn't a brute fact, right? So this is why I would argue, even with Aquinas, PSR is in the background, because he just assumes that Thumper just doesn't like spring and have actuality for no reason whatsoever, right? He's assuming that the world is intrinsically intelligible, that it's not absurd. So what Aquinas will do is he'll sort of order contingent things or metaphysically composite things in a causal series that he claims is necessarily terminating, right? For people who follow Aquinas, this is called an essentially ordered causal series, where there's the causality of the series is wholly derivative or instrumental among intermediary members, right? So Aquinas thinks that if you have a causal series concerning the existence of finite contingent things, right, it has to terminate, because if you just keep postulating contingent things, you have nothing in the series in virtue of which the causality could actually be introduced. So he actually thinks that a causal series that would regress infinitely, that is essentially ordered, is something of a contradictory structure. He would actually say that it's a causal series with no causality at all. So it's nonsense, right? So what Aquinas famously argues is that if you have a causal series of this sort, it has to terminate in some primary or fundamental member that has the causality or the causal property in virtue of what it is, right? Now, if we're considering the causality of existence, then Aquinas is going to say we have to trace back to something whose essence just is its existence, right? And not just includes existence, because that wouldn't really make sense, because then the existence part would have to cause the other parts, right? So it really has to be like pure existence or pure actuality, right? And that's his philosophical conception of God. And with other metaphysical principles like the convertibility of being and goodness and all that stuff, he thinks you can actually, and I think he's right, you can draw like the full suite of classical divine attributes, simplicity, immutability, omnipotence, omniscience. And I have a whole section in my book kind of showing that. So these are distinct approaches, right? Aquinas and Leibniz's approaches are different. I think they bear a family resemblance. They could all be called cosmological arguments, but they definitely are different. But I do claim that Aquinas' argument still like the PSR is in the back pocket, right? He's not upfront about it, but he is assuming that there aren't just brute facts hanging around, right? Mm-hmm.
Did the editor put in their naughty Thumper, or was that you?
Naughty, no. So it's so funny we brought up Gary Michuta, right? Because Thumper was the name of his bunny rabbit. That's where I got Thumper from.
Wow!
And Thumper, very sadly, is deceased. He actually had a massive seizure and died. It's not every day you hear of a poor bunny having a massive seizure. So God rest Thumper. But hopefully, he's immortalized in the sense of this book, because philosophers always use like Phaedo. I just wanted to not use Phaedo or Socrates for my example. So I'm like, I'll use Thumper the bunny rabbit. So that's where he came from.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with this framework in mind, then you then compare. You call it which one takes the explanatory cake? Naturalism, or basically a loving God who willed everything into existence. And you take the basically your mission is to show that naturalism can explain some things.
Mhm.
And that's important because, often an atheist might be reading a book by a theist, and it just seems like the theist might be just negating everything.
Mhm.
And in this book, the naturalist or the atheist who's going to be reading would say, well, he admits that naturalism can explain
Right.
a lot of things, but not it can only explain a portion of what theism can explain. And you obviously forewarn the reader about the nature of God. God's not something you can explain like just comprehensively, right? And I thought that was good to do because so many people need to they need to refine what is meant by God, because it could be, I think you alluded in your book, it could be that your skepticism was justified because of having a false conception of what God is.
Mhm.
And you take through that rigorous exercise of showing through the contingency and being in essence
Mhm.
existence and being equal, showing what this thing is. This is what we mean by God. So could you explain a little bit why this, the the needle for you
Mhm.
is moving in towards theism as taking the explanatory cake versus naturalism, because naturalism has this portion, it can and explain some things, but it's just totally outmatched.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. So I want to say a lot about that because that's a really good question. And that's correct. I do say that. Yeah. So my book, just to back way up for a minute to give people a little more perspective, is interested in attempting to reverse what I think is a very provocative argument for atheism. And it goes something like this: hey, if two theories can explain just as much, believe the simpler. Theism and atheism explain the same amount, but atheism is simpler. So believe that. And so my sort of, fundamental thesis is not so fast. I want to say that atheism can only explain some, I do say some, but not all of what theism can, but only when strapped with far greater complexity. And then what I
Right.
do is I line up all the things that I think a worldview needs to explain, from metaphysically composite beings to order, stability, rationality, consciousness, suffering, evil. And in each case, I make the case. Sometimes I'm a bit more aggressive and bold and say, look, I don't think naturalism actually has a good explanation for this. Like when it comes to why are there any contingent metaphysically composite things, I really only think classical, honestly. Like this is like where we're just being honest about how we feel, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
really only think classical theism can give a principled explanation of that, right? But I would say that if you're a non-classical theist, you hold like a complex God view, man, the naturalists they're going to get you,
Yeah.
right? And we can talk about why I think that's the case, and yeah, maybe we should, because I think it's important. Um, but ultimately, it comes down to how the naturalists can just make certain, parity objections and appeal to greater simplicity. Like if you don't have that profound category shift that the classical theist has, that sort of in principle difference that
Yes.
gives you that
Right.
that truly transcendent first principle of everything, then I think you kind of just get into kind of a brute facts arms race, right? And I think the naturalist is going to give the theist a really hard time, right?
Yeah.
So if you're that kind of theist, then I'd be willing to say that the naturalist can kind of explain it, kind of, right? Because the naturalist can just say, hey, look, I have a necessary physical state of reality, and through some sort of appeal to quantum mechanics, it can spit out a contingent order or something like that, right? The naturalist will say something like that. So the question is, well, okay, that's a nice thing to say, right? But how can something be a truly necessary being in the first place, right? Like, and why? Like, what could be relevantly different about something that it could be like an actually? And it's not just. Here's an important clarification: we're not just looking for necessity. We're looking for true ontological independence or self-sufficiency. There's all sorts of necessary beings that still have a dependency on something deeper. Even Aquinas was aware of that, right? They're necessary, but they're still, I give a silly example in my book. Like imagine a Pop-Tart was so great that God just had to create it. Its goodness was so he just eternally creates a Pop-Tart. So it had to exist, right? You have modal collapse over the Pop-Tart, right? It's necessary. It couldn't have been otherwise, but it's still causally dependent on God.
Of
There's
course.
more serious examples than that, but this just illustrates the point that necessity by itself isn't the appropriate stopping point. true ontological independence is. And then the question is, what could be truly ontologically independent? And I think if you do good metaphysics first, and you get the act potency distinction, the form matter distinction, the essence existence distinction, and you run the cosmological argument that way, you get to a being whose essence just is its existence, a being of pure actuality. And this gives you really cool results, because now you have a principled explanatory stopping point, right? It's non-arbitrary. We have something that is truly relevantly different than the things that need to be explained in a pretty profound way. And also, I think, secures a very robust monotheism. For Aquinas, a being that just is pure existence, is simple and self-sufficient. It's simple because its nature is just its existence, right? It's pure existence, and it's self-subsistent because it exists in virtue of what it is. Its nature is just to be. And it's non-multipliable, because if you were to try to have multiple instances of this thing, it would require some degree of ontological complexity, like grounding various qualities or properties that are grounded. That's an ontological complex, to have some sort of differentiating feature or something like that, right? So Aquinas thinks it would literally contradict the nature of a being whose essence is his existence to have multiple instances of it. So he thinks that this sort of locks in monotheism. And I think he's right about that, right? It gives you a robust monotheism. There's one of these things. There can only be one of these things. It's qualitatively unrestricted. It's purely actual. It's omnipotent. It's perfectly good, because if you have the convertibility thesis between, goodness and being, a being that is just pure being or pure actuality will be pure goodness, right? That doesn't mean it's a moral agent like human beings are, but it is right to say that God is pure goodness. So this is why I like the metaphysics first approach, because this is how you actually are able to say that the first cause or the necessary being actually is God, and why it's relevantly different in a way that nothing else, there's no other contender that I think could be an actually adequate explanation, right? This is the only thing in town, conceptually, that I can see, right, that I've ever been able to see. And that, I think, that gives a classical theist a decided advantage. But again, if you have a sort of composite form of God, where God is a complex of various sorts, and just kind of brutally, like why God has these attributes, why they hang together with necessity or whatever, and so God never really escapes the categories that seem to point out for some sort of extrinsic explanation, right, of why these qualities and properties are grounded or combined just the way that they are, and so on and so forth. Man, the naturalist is going to be right after you, right? They're going to be like, look, if you can have brute facts in your worldview, and you can just call this complex and necessary being, then I'm just going to scoot forward to some initial physical state, and I'm going to call that the necessary being, right?
Yeah.
So that's a whole, I hope that makes sense, but that's why I'm a classical theist, right?
Yeah.
Now, sorry, now I kind of forget your original question. Oh, the other,
why is it? Because I love the way the rest of the book is structured, based off of, which one has the best explanatory power, naturalism, or a volitional God who loved and created.
Mm-hmm.
And you bring out the things, morality, beings like us, suffering and evil. Where does naturalism run out of gas?
Yeah.
Because the way from what I see in the book, you left no breathing room, like almost no breathing room for naturalism, and obviously, they can explain some things, but it requires more, just coming up with the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing of trying to figure out how to give an explanation.
Yeah, it requires usually bringing in some adjunct hypotheses and certain complications. That depends, and this is where I always want to be careful and charitable, right, on the type of naturalist that you're talking to, right? So let's take the morality example. I won't get into all the details. I do give a sort of moral argument. I think most moral arguments are very bad, just frankly. But I give a sort of metaphysical moral argument in the book. But this is a little bit tricky because not everybody agrees on the data to be explained, right? So we have to get agreement there. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's think about the moral dimension. I think a lot of people, if not most people, are moral realists. I do think most people are moral realists. And a moral realist who thinks that there are true moral claims, right? That it makes that we can be wrong in moral judgments because there are mind or stance independent moral facts, concerning moral values and obligations, right? That some things are really wrong about to do, even if I desire them, right? But not everybody is a moral realist. Many naturalists are moral anti-realists, right? That they think whatever morality does, it kind of reduces to sentiment, following Hume, right? And what they're kind of thinking here is that morality is just sort of programmed into us through evolutionary forces, and it was useful to help us to have sex and avoid bears. But there's no reason to think that this is some window into some, actual moral dimension of the world, right? They're just false but useful beliefs, right? Okay, so this kind of makes things a little bit difficult because in one sense, the theory is determining the data rather than the other way around, right? So the naturalist is starting from a naturalistic, reductive, Darwinian mode of explanation. And it's important to understand, like, what's motivating naturalism in the first place? Well, assuming it isn't just something like the problem of evil, which it could be, it's something like science rocks. We can science everything, right? And so this means that we have a sort of combinatorial method of explanation where we just, it's the atoms and the laws we use to combine them, right? That's going to explain everything that we need. Some combination of atomic and evolutionary theory that will give us the explanation we need. So it's an appeal to, explanatory or epistemic superiority and a broad scientism that motivates naturalism. Now, if you're taking that approach, and that's why you're a naturalist, then I think it actually makes a lot of sense to be a moral anti-realist, to say there are no objective moral facts, right? And many naturalists are. Old atheists, you got people like Alex Rosenberg, very notorious for just being a total nihilist, right? But I think that is a consistent position that sort of comes, I don't know if I want to say inevitably, but seems to be very strongly coming out of the inner logic of naturalism, right?
Yeah.
However, many naturalists are like, oh no, I ain't going, I'm not I ain't no nihilist, right? Hell no, right? I'm a moral realist, right? Some things really are bad and you will never convince me otherwise, right? So what they need is somehow to avoid Darwin's dilemma, right? They need to escape Darwin's acid, as it's sometimes called in literature, from burning through all that stuff, right? Okay. All right. So, well, now you're in a competition with a theist, right? Because now we agree that moral realism is true. So who's got the better theory? And what I do without getting into details of it is, hey, look, any naturalistic theory that is not moral anti-realist is going to have a lot of complications, and it's sort of like politics, right? It's going to have the illusion of progress really just by replacing one problem with another, like by making appeals to strong emergence or Platonic entities or stuff that just like doesn't fit in the inner logic of naturalism, and just like so complicates the worldview arbitrarily to try and hold on to some sort of explanation of the moral phenomena that I will still argue is still not a very great explanation at the end of the day. But I'm willing to grant, okay, this is kind of an explanation. So I'll grant that this is kind of an explanation. But hey, theism has the advantage of being able to give a much more systematic, robust explanation from without having to, conjoin all these auxiliary hypotheses to it. This is sort of, this what we would expect in terms of moral dimension sort of just flows very naturally from the wider theistic worldview, which isn't just the existence of God, but it's other metaphysical commitments as well. Essentialism and teleology being the big ones, right? That there are real things with abiding centers of activity, dynamic things oriented towards certain ends that we have not yet reached, right? Which itself requires an act potency distinction, which itself bleeds into a cosmological argument, right? So I sort of use morality to kind of like poke into a cosmological argument, right? A metaphysical argument for God. So that, of course, is like the broad sketch, but it kind of shows the contours of the debate and why things are not always so quick and easy as people make them out to be. But at the end of the day, that is what I argue, is that where naturalism can try to keep up in the explanatory race, it usually involves having to go against the inner logic of naturalism and bring in a bunch of, ad hoc or auxiliary hypotheses that just end up making the theory, I think, overall very unstable and unbelievable, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Right. And that's why you say in the beginning that it can only explain what it can only explain what theism can explain when strapped with greater complexity.
Mm-hmm.
Because all that is, that Darwin's acid is causing them to pedal faster and faster to escape what looks like an impending doom, obliterating any kind of moral realism.
Yeah, and I always like be like, again, because sometimes atheists will say, "Well, I am a moralist." I know there's many atheist moralists out there. I know, right? I am aware of this, right? But let's not forget what the sort of commitments and inner logic of naturalism is, and what sort of seems to follow from that, and the sort of what the costs are going to be, to avoid a lot of those implications in the greater debate. So that's the general idea. And just think about it this way, if naturalism is something like so theism is run by a principle of pure actuality or pure perfection, right? Naturalism of one mainstream variety is run by a principle of indifference, right? That's the kind of whatever the root of reality is, it's indifferent. And you'll have other commitments like source physicalism, which is the commitment that, okay, whatever the mental realm is, it's late, it's local, it's not fundamental reality, right? The physical precedes the mental, whatever. That doesn't tell you a whole lot. Like, what do you expect from a principle of indifference? Nothing, man. I don't expect anything, right? So it doesn't do a lot to sort of constrain the probability space. But as I argue with the theistic metaphysical system, which again is very rich, you can get a lot of anticipations of the sort of world you would expect, and why God might even create a world to begin with, right? So I want to also emphasize, not every atheist will agree with this, but a lot of atheists do not say, smart atheists do not say that theism is not predictively powerful. They're happy to grant that theism is enormously powerful in the things it can explain. Their biggest beef is they think it predicts too much. They think that if there's a being that's perfect at the bottom, then everything should be perfect on top, right? And that's the problem of evil, right? So they think they don't think that theism, a lot of them don't think that theism underpredicts. They think it overpredicts, that we should have a more perfect world, right? So it's just important, I think, for people to see that is a very common stance. And a lot of the very smart, naturalists that I'm interested in reading who are very smart, they don't think theism is irrational. They don't think that it can explain a lot. They just think it has an issue with the problem of evil, and that naturalism can explain just as much and is simpler. Right? Mm-hmm. The conversation on the professional level is always, I think, a lot more ironic and more sophisticated, and also a lot very different than on the popular level too, as you know, Eric, in your own area.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow, that is just remarkable. I mean, there's just so much in the book. There's examples after example. But we've got some audience questions here, but I had another question before we get to the audience. How has the feedback been? People reading, the readership, what have you heard from people?
Yeah, amazingly, overwhelmingly great stuff, even from my atheist and agnostic friends. I've got lots of great atheists that I correspond with and that follow my podcast, and I've had a number of them publicly recommend my book, which is really amazing. I don't know if they've converted or flipped because of it. Who knows? What's going on internally. I assume that they still probably disagree with a lot of what I say, but they have very kindly shared something on my page the other day from an atheist account that was saying kind things about my book. So
any nasty responses?
Amazingly none, aside from the random Facebook snarky comment from somebody who just hears about the book but hasn't read it. No. Now it's still early, it was just published back in October, so it's making the rounds, and I have a few papers forthcoming, one on the problem of evil in a volume, and I co-authored this with Dr. Jim Madden. And that volume has some very other good atheistic contributors to it, like Graham Oppie and stuff like that. So what I'm doing is I'm further developing the argument I gave in my book on the problem of evil in that volume. So I'm hoping that will facilitate more conversation around it as well. Because in many cases, I think that was probably the most provocative portion of my book. But yeah, I wish I had more for you there. It's been surprisingly supportive and positive and unexpected too, because the book kind of came out at first, Eric. This is weird, and like people seem to like it, but it was kind of a little quiet, right? And that's kind of what I expect. It's a philosophy of God book. It's a little nerdy. It's not, but then like 2 or 3 months ago, a number of people just came out and just said, like, a lot of influential people said a lot of really good things about it, and just kind of took off. And like, this was unfortunate because I had turned my attention to other projects, and then I kind of like got sucked into all these podcasts and interviews on the book. I'm like, I forgot everything I read and wrote in that at this point.
I knew this was a special book. I really did. And I'm going to, I want my sons to read it. My oldest son, Evan, you've met my family.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I want him to read it over the summer, give it his best shot, because he's going to go into 11th grade. I don't expect him to be able to, understand everything, but they've crammed enough Plato and some of the pre-Socratics under it, and so his philosophy class, like, it's just pure discussion, Socratic discussion.
That's very cool. That's very cool.
And he's done well. His philosophy professor has always come up to me to tell me that he's doing well. So I want to give him. I'm assigning him this over the summer. We'll see how he does with it, but it's a very special book. I just don't know how you can come away with this as a naturalist, being confident of naturalism. And the book doesn't try to successfully bring you to the Catholic sacrament of baptism. It's a book about whether God exists, right? But that's going to kick up other questions, and so this was a labor of love. It was a huge benefit to the kingdom of God, and I can't praise you. Like, it's really, words can't describe. I know you probably think that's a lot, and I think you're probably
making me blush.
you're trying to maintain reality, and I'm sure there was a lot of scholars who helped. You quote from Stump, Fezer, and others, but you definitely integrated together a beautiful book. So if I don't know if you have a few moments for some audience questions.
Yeah, and then I just got to cook Christine some burgers. My great editor, right? Yeah.
No worries. Okay, so first one. Oh, glad to see you, Eric. When are you debating Jay Dyer again? I don't think I will be debating him again. Speaking of which, Jay Dyer, you had mentioned how whenever you deny classical theism, and then you enter back into this brutal area where it's like everything's on the same plane, and some of the Eastern Orthodox who take a strong reaction against classical theism, absolute divine simplicity, they find themselves arguing with the Neoplatonists. And I've seen a number of Orthodox leave for Neoplatonism, which is interesting. I don't know.
Well, I mean, you can probably guess which direction my sympathies are, but coming from the purely philosophical perspective of ultimate explanation and intelligibility, I'm a Neoplatonic Thomist at the end of the day, right? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So I almost think that the Neoplatonists, like Plotinus, is going to win that debate with somebody who doesn't allow for that total category evacuation that classical theism supplies.
Yeah, if people want a good article on this, try to remember the name. I think it was Dr. Caleb Coho, published a few years ago. Something like, why complex theism is on a metaphysical par with pantheism or something like that. That would be relevant to this sort of discussion, right?
Yeah. Okay. One question for Pat. Can you be a Catholic and a presuppositionalist?
Well, and still be Orthodox? Sure, I guess so, right? I don't think there's any declaration from the church. Against
Right.
that, I will say personally, this is not an area that I have really spent a lot of time researching at all. So I'm just not gonna say a whole lot about it. I know what the approach is generally, but it's just not been my area, right?
Yeah, yeah, neither mine. I have a friend of mine who is, and he's prepared to defend presuppositionalism, but I haven't really had time to really discuss with him anything about that. All right. Does Pat have any thoughts on the validity of Scotus's argument from
Yeah.
contingent to necessity?
Yeah, I think it's good. So he didn't have the same logical system that we do, but people who assess his argument these days say he would be committed to something like S5, system of modal logic. So if you want a good development of it that I find very provocative and interesting, check out the essay from James Ross, one of my favorite philosophers. Brilliant mind. He was at the University of Pennsylvania. This is the most rigorous development of Scotus's argument that I've seen, and I find it quite fairly convincing in the Cambridge Companion to Scotus. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Eddie Rodriguez says, I once heard the opposition that a God that needs to create implies some sort of incompleteness. Therefore, God is not perfect. What would be a proper answer to this
Yeah,
objection?
just that God didn't need to create. Yeah, certainly.
Right.
Certainly
Right.
no classical theists would maintain that. We would say that God is perfect goodness, but there's two ways of enjoying one's goodness. You can rest in it or you can share it. So creation is an act of gratuity, right?
So this would be news to me.
It is news. It's kind of fresh news, actually. So there we go. This is the first time I'm announcing it in public, I guess. Caught me.
Oh wow. Okay.
No,
I
that's
didn't.
good. No, let's do it. We'll break it. We'll break it here. So yeah.
Okay. Wow. So that's amazing. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thanks. So Christine's been asking me for several years if I was going to do the PhD thing, and I've just haven't really wanted. Well, I wanted to, but it never made sense, right? Because for people who don't know what I do, is I run my own business, so I'm not a professor. I'm not in academia, so it would be purely for personal interests. Let's just say that things lined up in a way that the opportunity was too good to say no to it. So for the
Wow.
next 3 years, I'm going to be writing a dissertation on the theoretical fruitfulness of divine simplicity, if all
Wow.
goes according to plan. Yeah.
This is super exciting, Pat. Wow.
Mhm.
Congratulations. Yeah, that's just boy. Yeah, I'm excited to see what comes of this. So, all right. Well, we got basically all the questions done here. And
This has been a
everybody,
real joy, Eric. As always, I miss talking to you, man. I really do.
yeah,
I miss sitting
yeah,
out on
no,
my
it's
back deck and having these kinds of
oh
conversations.
yeah,
Yeah.
oh yeah. We used to have a blast out there. Yeah, that was great. Where's the best place to get the book?
Oh, I guess the easiest is probably Amazon or wherever people usually
Right,
get their books. But
yeah,
I know Sophia likes it. Sophia likes it if you
right,
get it directly from the publisher.
right,
So if you feel so inclined to not feed that gigantic monolith of
right.
and yeah, just Sophia, is it Sophia Institute? I should probably know. I should probably know the website for the book. If you just
Yeah,
Google it,
I,
you'll
I, I've,
find it.
I've
Yeah.
tried to I've tried to help do the marketing, for Saint, the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. I need to do better with the papacy book, but I know how that is. Everybody goes to Amazon anyway. So, all right,
Right.
well, Pat, I know that you've got things to do, so I, I thank you for coming on my channel for explaining all that to me and to my audience. And where can people find you, real quick, before we go?
Yeah, well, thanks so much. Well, I have a YouTube channel that might be of interest to people here. That's Philosophy for the People. So if you just search me up with that, you'll find that. Eric has been on my channel several times. We'll have to make sure that we do another one there soon. And I would say Facebook, but my Facebook page is pretty boring. I got a Substack. There we go. If you just look me up it's Chronicles of Strength, actually, because it's a mix of fitness and philosophy on the Substack. But Substack Chronicles of Strength, that's where you'll find more of my philosophy content.
Okay. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, share, all that stuff to help me out. And we'll see you guys next time. Pat, God bless you, brother.
God bless you.